October 22, 1942, southwest of Stalingrad, USSR. The ground was already frozen by late October, the kind of cold that turned even tank grease into syrup and made metal snap if struck at the wrong angle. At dawn, the horizon was a fogged sheet of grey where the steppe met the sky, as indistinguishable as breath in frost. From the dark, a convoy of T-34s crept forward, steel beasts trudging through a corridor of scorched earth and dead wheat. Tracks ground into the mud, black exhaust rising in twin columns behind each turret. This was the 193rd Tank Brigade, under-strength, undersupplied, and, after 6 days of continuous assault, operating on desperation. But inside the turret of Tank 327, Sergeant Fyodor Antonovich Melkin wasn't thinking about the cold or the odds, or even the German panzers they would soon face again. He was thinking about wire. 2 spools of it, looped around a canvas satchel he kept tied to the inside of the hull. And he was thinking about a question no one else seemed to care to ask anymore. What happens when the enemy has learned exactly where to shoot? The T-34 had been a miracle once. When it first rolled off the lines at Kharkov in 1940, its sloped armor and 76.2mm gun had been nearly invulnerable to anything short of a direct hit from a German 88. Even the feared Panzer IV had struggled to penetrate it. But in the crucible of the Eastern Front, miracles became statistics. By late 1942, German tank crews had adapted. They aimed at the lower glacis plate, beneath the sloped armor. They knew the weak spot in the turret ring. And worst of all, the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers now carried 37mm BK 3.7 cannons that could split a T-34 open like a steel melon if they struck from above. It wasn't just about building better tanks anymore, it was about staying alive inside the ones they had. Melkin was a former factory apprentice from Rostov who had studied mechanical engineering for 2 years before the war pulled him into uniform. At first, he had been assigned to logistics, then to repairs. Then, after Kursk lost a third of its tankers in 2 days, into the driver's seat, then loader, then commander of his own T-34. He had seen 5 different crews come and go. Most didn't last more than a week. Some didn't last a day. But Tank 327 had survived 4 engagements in 2 weeks. And Melkin wasn't convinced it was luck. "I watched that Stuka line up 3 of ours," he had told his crew just days before, "one after another, all hit in the same place, engine deck, all gone." They nodded. They had seen the same. "And we were in the open too, why not us?" No one had an answer. That's when he started the modifications. He did it quietly, when the mechanics were off trying to swap out a cracked final drive on Tank 314. He asked no one's permission. There wasn't anyone to ask. The officers were too busy pleading for fuel and ammunition. The quartermaster was dead. The regimental engineer had been captured during the Kharkov retreat. Melkin stripped a dozen meters of copper wire from a downed communications truck, then took a set of metal scrap panels from the wreck of an abandoned BA-10 armored car. Using bolts scavenged from tank skirts, he rigged a network of hanging plates above the engine deck and turret roof, suspended just 5 inches above the tank's hull by 4 uprights of rebar and hooked wire. It looked absurd, like someone had draped a broken cage over the tank's spine. The men laughed. Some called it a Siberian sun hat. Others said it looked like a chicken coop. But Melkin just kept working. He wasn't trying to stop a direct hit. That was impossible. But he'd seen the effect of shaped charges and high-velocity rounds. They detonated on contact, and their penetration depended on focused force. A delayed or deflected detonation, just a few inches off target, could mean the difference between a dead crew and a tank that could limp back to repair. 5 centimeters of air, he muttered as he adjusted the wire, can be the whole sky when death is falling at 600 kilometers per hour. By the time they rolled toward the hamlet of Peshanka on October 22nd, Tank 327 looked like a Frankenstein machine. The rest of the brigade was already writing it off. But Melkin had a theory, and a war that no longer cared how things looked. What happened next would pass through whispers and after-action reports for months, but the first to see it were the men inside the other tanks. At 0930 hours, the German attack came. First the rumble, distant and deep like rolling thunder behind the hills. Then the shriek of shells, then the sky-blackening dive of the Stukas, 3 Ju-87s peeled out of the clouds, diving nearly vertical onto the column. There was nowhere to run. The steppe offered no cover. Just open ground, soft from rain and churned by tank treads. Tank 314 took the first hit, a 37mm round, straight into the engine deck. It burned in 30 seconds. Crew dead. Tank 288 tried to veer, throwing its track in a ditch. The second Stuka banked and dropped another shell straight into its turret ring. It cracked like an egg. Smoke, no survivors. Then they came for Tank 327. From the air, the Stuka pilot saw the same outline. Flat roof, dark green armor. He didn't see the wire, didn't care. He lined up, fired. Observers on the ground reported what looked like a direct hit. The pilot later claimed it as such, but the crew of 327 knew the truth. The shell struck the metal mesh Melkin had bolted in place. The force of the detonation vaporized the plate, but the charge spent itself in air and shredded steel before it could penetrate the true armor. The tank jolted, but held. Inside, everything rang. The crew was half-deafened, but the gauges still glowed. The periscope still showed sky. Melkin exhaled. "They missed," his gunner shouted. "They didn't," he corrected. The second strike came minutes later, this time from an anti-tank gun dug in behind a collapsed barn to the east, a direct line of sight. Tank 327 advanced, returning fire, but another shell struck, again high on the turret roof, where the gunner's hatch had once been blasted open on another tank. Same result, shrapnel, noise, a smoking crater in the mesh, but the crew still breathing. It happened again at noon, then again at 14:30. 5 separate hits across 6 hours of combat, from air and ground, from the same angles that had killed a dozen other tanks that day. But 327 kept rolling, and it kept killing. The fifth engagement happened on the edge of the village, where German infantry had fortified a roadblock with a PaK-40. As the tank approached, Melkin ordered a hard stop. He turned the turret, aimed above the fortification, and fired high explosive. The gun emplacement erupted. The road was theirs. That night, as the brigade counted its losses, nearly half of its strength, Tank 327 idled in the darkness, steam rising from its deck, men inside, dazed but alive. The mechanics finally approached. One stared at the melted remnants of wire and scrap hanging off its roof. "What the hell is this?" he asked. "5 tricks," Melkin said. "Looks ridiculous." It worked. The next day, 6 other tanks in the brigade began attaching similar mesh constructs. 3 weeks later, in a field memo sent to Moscow, Colonel Belyakov of the 193rd wrote, "Field improvisation by Sergeant F.A. Melkin appears to have increased survivability in exposed engine compartments under aerial assault. Recommend further experimentation. Suggest pattern designation, Melkin Mesh." It would take months for the suggestion to be noticed, but by 1943, entire battalions of T-34s entering the Southern Front carried variations of the same contraption. Some were better engineered, others were hasty imitations, but the idea remained the same: detonate the fire before it finds the heart. The official term eventually used by Soviet engineers was raised screen anti-penetration layer, though most tankers just called it the cage. In some factories it was nicknamed Melkin's skeleton, but in the 193rd Tank Brigade it remained simply Fyodor's hat, not out of mockery anymore, but something closer to reverence. In the weeks following the battle near Peshanka, the Red Army's thrust toward Kalach intensified. The German Sixth Army, entrenched around Stalingrad, was slowly being squeezed by Soviet counter-offensives in the north and south. Amid these operations, tank survival rates were so low that loss tolerance exceeded 40% in some brigades per week. Engineers couldn't keep up. Doctrinal manuals were outdated within months. It was no longer a matter of superiority. It was a question of who could survive long enough to shoot back, and Tank 327 kept doing exactly that. In early November, the brigade received a rare reprieve, 2 days of rest and light repair duties behind the lines near the banks of the Don River. For once, there was time to assess damages. Tank crews inspected torn track guards, ruptured gearboxes, scorched filters. But when Melkin opened the turret hatch of 327, he was holding a charcoal pencil, not a wrench. He began marking the shell impacts from the previous engagements, each one a black ring, traced where the fragments had scorched the mesh. The turret roof, engine deck, and rear armor each bore the ghosts of death averted. 5 rings, 5 failures to kill, 5 reasons to keep drawing breath. He traced the final ring in silence. Then he took a length of coiled wire, twisted it into a circle, and fixed it over the burned center of the last mesh plate, like a crown nailed into steel. "What are you doing?" asked Corporal Reznikov, the loader. "Memorial," Melkin replied, "to every shot that didn't find us." The repair crews watched. Then something strange began to happen. Other tankers began painting rings, at first in chalk, then in oil-based paint. Soon, entire units began keeping tallies. Not kills, but survivals. A new kind of score. By the 3rd week of November, the 193rd was reassigned to Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet envelopment of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. The offensive was one of the most complex coordinated maneuvers the Red Army had attempted to date, involving over 1 million Soviet troops, attacking from north and south to trap over 300,000 Axis forces. Tank 327 was placed on the southern push, toward Kletskaya. The terrain was open, brutal, and choked with snow. Luftwaffe resistance was ferocious. The Germans had begun deploying heavier, better-armed panzers, including early models of the Panzer IV IOSF. G, with longer-barreled 75mm guns capable of piercing T-34 armor at 800 meters. The mesh wasn't supposed to stop those, but again, Melkin wasn't trying to stop everything. He was trying to break the logic of precision killing. He believed that if the enemy could be made uncertain, if their shots could be just a little off, their advantage would shrink. He proved it again on November 24th. The brigade approached a frozen crossroads outside Blinovo. Ahead, a defensive column of 4 German panzers waited hull down behind ruined buildings. Mines littered the open ground. The Soviet advance was delayed for nearly 4 hours. Orders came down to push through at any cost. 3 tanks were destroyed on approach. The 4th bogged in a shell crater. Tank 327 advanced alone. Melkin issued his commands with a surgeon's calm. Gunner 3 degrees right, loader he next, driver short burst, then left pivot. They zigzagged. The Germans fired. First shot wide, second deflected off the left track guard. Third struck high on the turret, exploded against the cage. The explosion was massive, enough to shred the left side of the mesh into metallic confetti, but the crew was intact. They reached 600 meters. Melkin fired twice. The first shot missed. The second struck the lead panzer's chassis. Fire erupted. That moment would later be captured in a blurred photograph by a Soviet war correspondent embedded with the 65th Army. The image, grainy, black and white, shows a smoking German tank in the background, and in the foreground a T-34 with a warped mesh crown glowing with heat. It became one of the most widely reproduced tank photos of the Soviet advance. What no one knew, what the photo didn't show, was that Tank 327 had no armor upgrades, no extra plating, no special ammunition, just a few wires, a lot of stubbornness, and a belief in angles. After the engagement, Melkin finally received an audience with the brigade's senior engineer, Captain Mikhail Seredin. The man was skeptical at first. "You want me to report this structure to Stavka?" Melkin just nodded. Seredin examined the damage. He paced, measured, knocked on the ruptured plates. "You understand this is not regulation, not even technically armored protection?" "Yes. And yet, 5 direct hits?" "5, Melkin confirmed. Seredin said nothing for a long time. Then he took out a small notepad and scribbled a few lines. One of them included the word distributed impact diffusion. "Very well, I will write the memo." 2 weeks later, an official request from the 4th Tank Army arrived at the Uralvagonzavod plant in Nizhny Tagil, asking for prototype kits that mimicked the design. They were rudimentary, nothing more than mesh screens and suspended plating, but field reports from multiple brigades now supported the same claim. Reduced penetrative kill rates by 30% in targeted zones. That percentage became a rallying point in Soviet armor circles. 30% more tanks surviving meant 30% more guns firing back. And in the calculus of Eastern Front warfare, That could shift a whole battle. By January 1943, field workshops were retrofitting over 24 tanks per week with raised screen structures. Most of them based on Melkin's improvised schematic, hastily redrawn by Seradin's engineers from torn notebook pages and photographs. But Melkin himself had no interest in patents or recognition. He remained in Tank 327. It had lost its left tread twice. Its suspension was cracked. The turret had to be manually rotated at times. The crew operated in thermal gear just to survive the cold, the internal heater long dead. Yet the tank remained mobile, and every new panel of mesh they attached was done by hand, sometimes while under fire, always under stress. By mid-January, Tank 327 had survived 7 direct engagements with anti-tank fire. The mesh had been replaced 3 times. The nickname had changed again, from Fyodor's hat to Ghosthood, a name whispered by younger tank crews who thought it made 327 invisible or maybe invincible. It wasn't either. On February 4th, during a forward thrust toward Kalachna-Donu, the tank was hit directly by a 75mm round from a dug-in German gun. This time, the mesh had been torn off the previous day and not yet replaced. The shell struck clean, just below the turret. The blast severed the turret ring, instantly killing Corporal Reznikov. Melkin survived. So did the driver. The gunner was blinded permanently. They evacuated under cover of smoke. The tank burned. That was the end of Tank 327. But not the end of the story. Because the mesh survived. In design, in theory, and in practice. March 1943, 2 months after the destruction of Tank 327, Fyodor Antonovich Melkin stood on the loading platform at Depot No. 17 outside Gorky. He had no tank. He had no crew. What he did have was a battered leather case filled with scorched metal fragments, graphite sketches, and 2 folders of hastily assembled reports on something few officers wanted to take seriously: unarmored shielding systems. His transfer had come not through recognition, but attrition. With his tank gone and his eyesight slightly impaired from shrapnel exposure, Melkin had been declared unfit for frontline command. Instead of discharge, he was sent to the Gorky Armored Research Bureau, a backwater of technicians and theorists considered too valuable to waste, but too eccentric for real field command. Most of the men there had never fired a shell in anger. Many had been engineers before the war, now pulled into desperate efforts to improve armor resilience or weapon accuracy by margins too small for generals to notice. They worked with chalkboards and blueprints, not scorched steel and adrenaline. Melkin arrived like an anomaly. His ideas were not theoretical. They were burned into him. Every sketch he showed, every design he offered had been forged under fire. He had names, dates, impact locations, shell types, survival outcomes, photos, witnesses. The senior designer, a stooped man named Ilyin with tobacco-stained fingers and a limp, read through Melkin's notes with a blank expression. After 20 minutes of silent page flipping, he looked up and said, "You're telling me a few centimeters of space and a sheet of scrap wire kept 5 shells from killing your crew?" Melkin nodded. "Twice from Stukas, twice from AT guns. Once from a tank." "Yes." "Where's the tank now?" "Gone. February 4th. Ilyin folded his hands. "You think this is repeatable?" Melkin didn't hesitate. "I think it already is. You're just not tracking it." By April, Ilyin had assigned Melkin to a 3-man sub-team. Their job: field test various mesh-based shielding systems on new T-34 chassis before they were shipped south. Their first trials were almost laughably crude: welded fencing, chicken wire, chain-link barriers, anything that could be suspended a few inches above vital zones. They tested them with shaped charges from dummy launchers, small explosive warheads, and live-fire sessions using captured German rounds. The results were inconsistent, but intriguing. In some cases, the screens triggered premature detonation. In others, they caused a ricochet that diverted the jet stream away from vital internal components. Still others failed entirely. But even a 20% improvement in survivability under these conditions was gold. And then a breakthrough came. Not from the engineers, but from a recently transferred Georgian metallurgist named Akaki Galashvili. He proposed not just wire, but a combination of angled mesh with variable density, tighter weave over engine decks, looser near turret tops, with flex points that could deform and absorb shock without collapsing entirely. It was brilliant. And Melkin recognized the underlying principle: control the chaos. If you couldn't stop the blast, you could confuse it, misdirect it, force it to waste its fury on air and noise. By May 1943, they had a working prototype, the mesh overlay variant A3. And by June, 5 newly built T-34s fitted with the system were quietly sent to the 5th Guards Tank Army, now preparing for the massive confrontation west of Kursk. Melkin never saw them leave. He wasn't allowed to go, but he waited every day for the after-action reports. And in July they came. Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. On July 12th, at Prokhorovka, over 1,500 armored vehicles clashed in one of the most brutal armored engagements ever fought. The 5th Guards held the line against some of Germany's most elite SS Panzer divisions, and among the wreckage, among the burnt-out husks and scattered turrets, were 4 of the 5 prototype tanks, still moving, still fighting. One of them had taken 3 hits from Panzer IVs and survived. One had lost its mesh panels early, then been immobilized later. Another was found with shrapnel embedded in its outer mesh, the hull untouched. The 5th was lost entirely. But again, it wasn't about invincibility, it was about increasing odds, stretching the margin between death and life. By August 1943, Melkin's name appeared for the first time in an internal Red Army technical bulletin, albeit buried in the footnotes of a report titled Supplemental Screening Measures for Upper Hull Protection in T-34 and KV Variants. There was no mention of his tank, no mention of the dead crew, no photographs. Just field reports from units incorporating independent overlay structures suggest a statistically relevant decrease in penetrative lethality from aerial and AT assault. The origin of this adaptation is credited to Sergeant F.A. Melkin, formerly of 193rd Tank Brigade. That was it, but it was enough. By the end of 1943, hundreds of tanks across multiple Soviet fronts were being fitted with makeshift screens, rails, and wire systems. Some were formally issued. Most were built by the crews themselves, using whatever could be scavenged: barbed wire fencing, metal beds from abandoned houses. They called it Melkinization. No one had ordered it. No one taught it. It spread the only way good ideas do in war, through necessity and word of mouth. At the same time, German intelligence began taking notice. Captured documents from the 6th Panzer Division in late 1943 include an internal briefing on Soviet supplemental screening, noting increased incidence of Soviet T-34s surviving direct hits in sectors fitted with overhanging wireframes or netted mesh. These constructs are crude and improvised but appear to disrupt high-velocity shell behavior. Crews should be trained to compensate targeting angles accordingly. Even the Wehrmacht understood. What looked ridiculous from a distance could become lethal at close range. Melkin himself never returned to combat. He remained in research through 1945, eventually contributing to the early design considerations for post-war IS-3 tanks, particularly in areas concerning crew survivability. He rarely spoke of Tank 327 again, but in his drawer he kept one thing: a bent ring of melted copper wire fused to a scorched bolt, the only surviving piece of the first ghost hood. And on the back of a photo, one taken days after the Blinovo engagement, where his tank had stood smoking amid the snow, he had scrawled 6 words in faded graphite. Sometimes steel survives because it listens. As the war rolled into its final grinding chapters across Eastern Europe, the Red Army evolved, not just in size or tactics, but in philosophy. The Soviet war machine had begun the conflict with sweeping maneuvers and blind aggression. It would end it with a grim technical focus on survival and adaptation. At the center of this silent transformation were ideas like Melkin's. They were never written into doctrine. They weren't debated in staff colleges. They didn't appear in Pravda or on front-page propaganda posters. But they traveled quietly from unit to unit, embedded in field repairs, in whispered advice passed between tank commanders, in the chalk diagrams drawn on tank hatches by mechanics who had never even heard the name Melkin. By early 1944, it was no longer rare to see Soviet T-34s with raised mesh or improvised bar armor mounted above their engine decks. Some units began fitting rail cages made from spare track links and bent steel piping. Others used tensioned netting, layered with tarpaulins to simulate camouflage and disrupt enemy sightlines. All of it pointed back to a single concept: disrupt the known kill zones, break the enemy's muscle memory, force every shot to be a question again. The Germans responded the only way they could, by escalating. In March 1944, Panther tanks were fitted with additional optics for long-range firing. Tiger IIs, or King Tigers, began rolling into the field with 88 miniature guns that could blow clean through a T-34 from 1,000 meters. The war had become a brutal dialectic. Every new idea was answered with heavier metal, thicker armor, more precise destruction. And yet, in the margins of this clash of titans, small acts of improvisation continued to save lives. In the First Ukrainian Front, a T-34 crew near Vinnytsia rigged 2 sheets of railway grating above their hull. They survived 3 encounters with Panther tanks that same week. In the 1st Guards Tank Army, engineers began experimenting with spring-mounted netting, a crude attempt at giving the screens flexibility and multi-impact resistance. By May 1944, Soviet field workshops were issuing basic mesh kits with some newly repaired tanks. The documentation remained sparse. Most just included a single hand-drawn diagram, labeled with a phrase now unofficially recognized across multiple fronts: Melkin frame. It was rarely spelled the same way. Sometimes it was Melkinov. Sometimes Melkin cage. One Lithuanian tanker scrawled Melkonka on the side of his turret, believing it to be some kind of guardian spirit. But it meant the same thing: survive what you shouldn't. Meanwhile, Melkin himself had been assigned to the Central Committee on Armored Survivability, a short-lived division operating out of a repurposed textile mill in Chelyabinsk. His job was now advisory, evaluating reports, writing risk assessments, and inspecting field-recovered tanks for analysis. He hated it. He was surrounded by typewriters, not steel, paper, not fire. Worse still, he found himself answering to officers who had never been inside a burning tank, never heard the shriek of a Stuka bearing down, never watched men they knew get flash-burned alive because of an exposed fuel line. But he did the work. He marked up blueprints. He redlined draft designs. He spoke bluntly in briefings and left most meetings without waiting for consensus. One of his more damning memos, written in September 1944, reads, "If you cannot armor the roof, then lift the sky. 5 centimeters of air consistently applied will kill more shells than 2 centimeters of steel. Stop designing for ideals. Design for error, because the battlefield will supply plenty of it." It was not well received. One colonel scrawled in the margin, "Theorist nonsense, real protection, deals real armor." But field reports kept rolling in. By November 1944, post-battle assessments from the Second Ukrainian Front showed a 21% increase in turret survival among tanks equipped with mesh screens compared to those without, specifically when struck by heat shells or air-delivered anti-tank rounds. And then something unusual happened. An American liaison attached to the Red Army for observation, Captain Leonard S. Dorsey, visited a recovery depot near the Carpathians. He took photographs of several Soviet tanks with mesh cages and noted their effectiveness in a short classified report later sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground. His conclusion: Soviet crews appear to employ overhead screening and angled mesh to disrupt top-down penetrations. While primitive, these measures mirror theoretical studies from the British War Office regarding spaced armor. Field data suggests measurable benefit. Recommend further study for Allied use. The seed had been planted. In January 1945, as the final offensives against Berlin took shape, Soviet tank formations began incorporating even more aggressive forms of improvised protection, layered log armor, sandbags suspended over hulls, even sheets of broken glass embedded in rubber mats to disrupt infrared optics. But the mesh remained. A T-34 seen outside Kustrin was photographed by a war correspondent, its turret nearly hidden beneath a web of wire and broken fencing. Painted on the side was a single phrase, crudely stenciled in white: Prizrak Stali, the ghost of steel. It was a nod, though perhaps unknowingly, to the first name Tank 327 had been given by its crew. A superstition had grown among tankers by now. A belief that any tank that wore the ghost's hood had a better chance. That Melkin's idea wasn't just mechanics. It was a talisman. He knew better. There was no luck. There was only physics and timing and inches. May 9th, 1945. Victory. Berlin fell. The German war machine collapsed. The ruins of the Reichstag were filled with Red Army boots and echoes of cannon fire. Fyodor Melkin spent that day in silence, not in Moscow, not in a parade, but in the archive basement of an armored repair facility in Brest-Litovsk, cataloguing damaged tank components for post-war evaluation. There were no speeches, no medals, just reports, grease, and rusted fragments of steel. He opened a crate marked 327A retrieved material. Inside, a half-melted gear coupling, a shattered periscope, and a fragment of hull with a bolt still attached to it. Through it, the charred remains of a copper wire ring, blackened by heat but still intact. He closed the crate again. Fyodor Antonovich Melkin died in 1961 of lung complications from years of inhaling battlefield smoke and workshop fumes. He never wrote a memoir. He refused interviews. His name did not appear in Soviet textbooks or victory rolls. But in an obscure annex of the Museum of Armored Warfare in Kubinka, behind a reconstructed T-34 76 chassis, there is a small plaque. It reads, "Experimental Defensive Mesh Overlay, based on field adaptation by Unknown Sergeant, 1942. The name was redacted during the Cold War, but the design remained. And decades later, in wars far from the Don and the Volga, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Chechnya and Syria, armored vehicles once again began sprouting mesh cages, wire frames, raised armor skirts. By the 2000s, these came to be known in Western defense circles as slat armor or cage armor. But the idea was old, and somewhere, under layers of soot and anonymity, a soldier with frost-bitten hands and a spool of stolen wire had already seen it coming. Because sometimes the most important battlefield isn't measured in kilometers or divisions, but in the 5 centimeters between a warhead and the steel it never reaches.